Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Sarah Martin, and I am the Senior Manager of Programming and External Relations at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. The theme for today's discussion is Navigating Complexity and Challenge Right Now, Nonprofits' Needs and Funder Responses. We're so glad that you are joining us today. This webinar will focus in part on data from two new CEP research reports titled State of Nonprofits 2025, What Funders Need to Know, and Voices That Matter, How Nonprofits and Foundations Engage with the Communities They Support. For those of you tuning in who are new to CEP, I'd love to share a bit about us. Our work is focused on philanthropic effectiveness. For more than 2 decades, we've sought to help foundations and increasingly individual donors to improve their effectiveness and increase their impact. We do this through assessments and research reports that often lift up the perspective of those who wouldn't otherwise be heard, as well as programs like this one. We also do this through our Youth Truth Initiative, which harnesses student perceptions through validated surveys and tailored advisory services to help school leaders and education funders accelerate improvements. In addition to today's virtual program, we're very excited to host CEP's biennial conference in person this November. CEP 2025 is a 3-day conference for senior foundation leaders, donors, trustees, and program officers, and will take place this fall in downtown Los Angeles from November 3rd to November 5th. I encourage you to check out the full program at cep2025.org. And if you're interested in joining us, we are offering our early bird rate for a limited time. So please go to cep2025.org to register soon, as we expect to sell out, and I will be sure to put that link in the chat. On behalf of CEP, I want to thank the funders who supported the two reports we'll be discussing today, the McKnight Foundation, the Rita Allen Foundation, and Fund for Shared Insight. Next, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, we are in a webinar format, which means you all are muted and have your videos off. If you have questions for the panelists during today's presentation, and we certainly hope that you do, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. We will try to be responsive to as many questions as we can during our Q&A time. We will not be using the hand raising function, as we are not asking attendees to speak their questions. And if you require any kind of technical assistance, please reach out to the CEP events team at events@cep.org, and they can assist you. We'll also be sharing some resources with you via the chat box, so feel free to check there for helpful links. If you'd like to enable live captioning, please click the closed captioning button in your Zoom panel. And if you'd like to enable captions in your preferred language other than English, you can also do so in the Zoom control panel by clicking the arrow next to Show Captions and selecting your preferred caption language. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link to all registrants in a follow-up email. Now that housekeeping is out of the way, I have the privilege of introducing our speakers and panelists for today. Moderating today's session is CEP President Phil Buchanan. Phil will be in conversation with 5 fantastic panelists. Alicia Smith-Arriaga, Vice President of Research at CEP and lead author on both reports we'll be discussing today. Greg Croteau, CEO of UTech. Melinda Tuan, Managing Director of Fund for Shared Insight. Candace Jones, President and CEO of the Public Welfare Foundation. And President and CEO of the Wichita Community Foundation, Shelley Pritchard. Thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Phil.
Sarah, thank you so much. It's great to be with all of you. There's well over 1,100 folks, mostly funders, registered for this webinar. And it's obviously a very difficult moment for nonprofits as well as for funders, given the context that we're in. We're going to get into a lot of data, but I want to start first by inviting one of our panelists, Greg Croteau, CEO of UTech, to join me, and we're going to just root our conversation in your story, Greg, as a way to get us started. And it's great to see you. And obviously, I've known you a long time, Greg, and I've had the privilege of getting to know the organization that you lead, which is so impressive. And I've spent time with you and your staff and some of the young people who you serve. But for those who don't know UTech, can you just provide the basic overview of what it is your organization does?
Absolutely. Yeah. And Phil, thanks again to you and CEP and the funders for kind of just elevating this conversation, right? Because it's so important. And to be able to have 1,100 funders in the room, we really appreciate that. And so I'll be really brief. If anyone wants more information, our website just happens to be right up there and let us know. But I think, we're based in the Merrimack Valley of Massachusetts, so a little bit northwest of Boston. Strong, diverse immigrant community. UTEC, just stands for UTEC. It used to stand as United Teen Equality Center. Grassroots organization was actually founded by a group of young adults, and I have the pleasure of being kind of selected by them about 25 years ago. My background is also in street work, and so our kind of whole work is really focused on working with justice involved young adults 18 to 25-year-olds, the 10% that might be engaged in 90% of the action on the street, the influencers, the shot callers, and help and work with them to make changes not only in their own lives, but in the life of the community. And we do that. We're really values-driven organization. We do a lot of work around our values in the sense of chipping away, right? So we know that we have to work with young adults that might be involved in gangs. So we do a lot of work around peacemaking on the street, responding, unfortunately, when there are shots fired, responding when there's, unfortunately, homicides. We do work in the same ways we do outreach. We work in reach in the jails and the prisons. And then once young adults get engaged, it's all about their journey. It's all about the value of clean slate. We run our own social enterprises where we do cutting boards and mattress recycling. And then we do a lot of work with our young adults and alongside our young adults in terms of igniting social justice and the organizing and policy work. And we do that locally, and we do a lot of work nationally as well.
What do you know, Greg, about whether your program works?
Great question. And it's interesting because we're obviously going to talk about the DOJ cuts that at least
Yeah,
we experienced.
yeah.
And the one thing that we can say is, the data is very clear. And this isn't, about UTEC. This is about the field for us, right? And I
Mhm.
think nationally, when it comes to our center point is reducing violence and reducing recidivism, right? We know we have to start there, and then it's about someone's education and employment journey along the way as well. But we have to keep young people free from incarceration and violence on the streets. And the data is really clear nationally, Massachusetts, and locally. We started as a result of young adults standing up and saying, because in Lowell, second largest Cambodian community in the country, one of the largest, the most diverse communities in the country. We have about 25 active gang sets. And back in when we first started, um, you know, from where we started in 1999 to 2000, we just did a study all the way to look at up to 2020, there was a 67% reduction in violence. And that 67% reduction was not just because of UTEC. That was because of the partnerships between community-based organizations, law enforcement, other institutions. But we know the data is very clear. Recidivism data is very clear as well. It's working. And it's not just UTEC. It's the field of organizations kind of under the umbrella of community violence intervention. It's proven to be working, and that's why the federal government invested more over the past 4 years prior to the cuts.
So it's interesting because, like, one of the things that appealed to me about UTEC as an example that I lifted up in some things that I wrote was the way in which, Republicans and Democrats spotlighted. I mean, people might not know that Massachusetts sometimes has Republican governors, but
Yeah.
we do. And Republicans and Democrats alike, have highlighted UTEC as a program that works. And obviously you never know what the particular perspectives are of your donors and your board, but I think you've got a pretty broad coalition of folks
We
who've
do.
supported UTEC. So tell us what happened and how much federal funding do you typically receive? And tell us about this DOJ cut. How do you hear about it? Somebody call you, email you?
Yeah, no, I would have loved to receive a personal call from someone in the DOJ on this one. But unfortunately, like hundreds of others, on April 22nd, we got an email. I believe the exact time was 5:22, and in the evening, and our cuts were made effective immediately. I just happened to have the email up, and I will just read you a section of it if it's okay.
Yes, please.
So there's a lot of stuff in it, but it basically says this award is being terminated because it quote unquote no longer effectuates the program goals or agency priorities. End of quote. And then it goes on to say the department has changed its priorities with respect to discretionary grant funding to focus on, among other things, more directly supporting certain law enforcement operations, combating violent crime, protecting American children, and supporting American victims of trafficking and sexual assault, and better coordinating law enforcement at all levels of government. This award demonstrates that it no longer effectuates department priorities. And that's the message we got. And I can't see folks, but I would expect that a lot of folks might be shaking their head because respectfully, it just doesn't add up, right?
Right.
If you go back to your question, around data, again, not about UTech, but about the field, it has been proven to be effective. There's studies after studies that show that. And when you talk about it doesn't effectuate the goals, I mean, we're talking about Department of Justice, we're talking about public safety, reduction of violent crime. And the thing about this is, there's multiple layers to this, and I'll try to be brief, right? But like our success is because of the partnerships, right? And one of the fears I have in this is that where is that money going that's being cut, right? Now we got cut Department of Justice. Other folks got cut from Health and Human Services. In this case, is the money just being saved for some reason, or is it being reallocated to law enforcement? And if that's the case, then you're pitting people against each other, right?
Mhm.
And because our biggest supporters in many times have been law enforcement, right? Our police chief has said publicly, we can't arrest our way out of the problem, right? We need UTech, and it needs to be like, an acknowledgement of that. So we hope that that won't spill into that. But I think the bigger thing, I mean, we could talk about the financial impact, which is huge. We lost $2 million. So we, as an organization, a budget size of 17 million, 2 million is really significant for us. And we have a mixture of philanthropy and individuals. But the larger message, and that's why we also decided we want to speak up because we know certain folks don't feel comfortable. I remember when the first TV station interviewed us, they said, "Oh, we really appreciate you speaking because we've had trouble finding organizations that want to speak up." And I get it, right? As an organization that started with a grant of $40,000, right, and could have been shut down like that any day, it's it can be tricky territory. But I think we feel important to speak up because your budget is where you place your values, right? And you're in essence saying that the street workers, the violence interrupters, right, the folks that are on the ground are not important, right? They're not a valued part of the equation of solving that. And I think that's a huge, huge step back and a huge just miss and disregard for all the work that's been happening.
Yeah, it's um, incredible to see the work that your organization does. And yeah, it's life and death, and it takes, heart and soul and analytical smarts to do the work that you all are doing. And I was so affected in the time a number of years ago that I spent with you and your team by the fact that your street workers are trying to reach people at the moments they're more reachable. And what does that mean? It's like hospital bedsides. It's visiting someone in jail. It's showing up at a funeral
Exactly.
to see the friends of somebody and to recognize that that might be a moment of openness to reevaluating choices that are being made and the path that folks are on. So, like, this is no joke. It's really important work, and we should honor that work. And then to talk to the young people who've come through the program. One person you introduced me to, I remember, quoting him as saying, they fathered, mothered, brothered, and cousined me.
Yeah.
That they showed me love in a way that I hadn't experienced before. So it's just such important work, and I appreciate that you are willing to speak out about the funding cuts. Can you say a little bit more about the impact on your team, on your staff?
Yeah, I mean, there's the impact of like you had said, right? Street workers, outreach workers who go on the street, and you know, individuals that have had similar backgrounds for young adults that have had spent time, unfortunately incarcerated, now coming back and giving back, and it is a blow, right? To just hear that someone's not investing in the work that you have, right? After you are showing up at individuals' funerals and shots being fired, right? So you have that side of it. But the financial side of it, for us has been significant, right? I mean, fortunately, we're trying to lean on philanthropy, individual donors. We've appealed the decision, so they give you an opportunity to appeal that. We did that. There's also a class action lawsuit that was filed. So we're doing our best to hold off and wait to see where those come. But this was the first year we've had no new positions. Our budget this year had no new positions, and we had to eliminate some positions that were vacant, right? So we avoided being able to lay off anyone on our staff. And our hope is obviously to see what happens with the federal side of things, and then lean on other sources, and philanthropy obviously being a huge one. And then just keep the partnership work going, because as our work doesn't stop, right? Whether funding stops, right? Like our street workers have relationships on the street. The jails are counting us to show up every day, right? For individuals who are behind walls. And so we know we have to keep that work going forward. Anytime you interrupt that, it is a relationship stopper for our staff. And so we just, refuse to allow that to happen right now.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
So we'll have more questions for you with the group in a few minutes. But I think right now, what I'd like to do, and thank you so much, Greg, again, for sharing your story.
Absolutely.
And you'll be back. I'm now going to ask Alicia Smith Arriaga to join us and walk through some data about what nonprofits are experiencing today, as well as some insights about listening and how we can listen to folks in community. Dr. Alicia Smith Arriaga is CEP's Vice President for Research. She's a terrific colleague, and I'm so grateful to you, Alicia, for all the work by you and your team that went into what you're about to share with us. So I'm going to hand the stage to you, and then we'll bring our panel in to react after. Take it away, Alicia.
Right. Thanks so much, Phil. I am going to share my screen now and walk through the data. So there we go. So I'm excited today to share some new data that we have at CEP around navigating complexity and the challenges of this current moment. I'm really excited in a few minutes to hear from all the folks who are listed here on this panel and really have a conversation about what this data means for the field. And I'm going to be focusing today on actually two different sets of data. The first that I'll talk about is the Center for Effective Philanthropy's State of Nonprofits project. The State of Nonprofits, that project really aims to take the pulse of nonprofit leaders who receive foundation funding. We look at change over time in nonprofit leaders' perspectives and experiences. And another goal of this body of work is to really help individual and institutional funders better understand the nonprofit experience. You can see here the last few reports that we've done each year from 2023, 2024, and then this year, the 2025 data is what I'll be focusing more deeply on. As I noted in the just a minute ago, the funders for this work are the McKnight Foundation and the Rita Allen Foundation. And then just to make sure that folks understand like where this data is coming from, the goals of this project are really to elevate the nonprofit experience. And the sample that we'll be talking about today is representative of US-based nonprofits that have received funding from private foundations that give $5 million or more. Now, the methodology that we use is we survey a representative panel of nonprofits. This year, we completed this survey in February, and we had one of our highest response rates that we've gotten in the last decade. So 66% of respondents were able to complete the survey. And so this data represents 585 nonprofits from across the country. So our first finding is that nonprofit leaders describe difficulty pursuing their missions effectively in an environment that presents multiple significant challenges to their ability to operate. When we ask organizations what about the current political climate, what sorts of issues are top of mind and how it's impacting their organizations. The challenges that are most frequently reported were both the impact of the climate itself and how the climate is impacting their organization's staffing. And when we ask organizations a bit more about how the climate is affecting their work, the top three most frequently reported elements were the outcomes of the election, changes in federal funding, and then political division. This quote from a nonprofit leader represents much of what we were hearing. It is tough to do business as usual when our world and our core values are being challenged at every turn. How loudly should we raise our collective voices if doing so puts people at risk? And how might we channel the activism of the past and care for our communities responsibly and for the long haul? We also heard in the study from nonprofit leaders that 54% say their biggest staffing challenge is insufficient funding to recruit, retain, and support staff. Now, key finding 2. Similar to our 2024 study, most nonprofits achieved a balanced budget or a surplus in the last fiscal year. And despite challenging circumstances, they anticipate the same for this fiscal year. At the same time, leaders expressed uncertainty about future funding and concerns about increased cost. In this year's data, we see that 65% of leaders reported a balanced budget or a surplus last fiscal year, but we see that number is lower for the current fiscal year. And in this chart, we can see in the orange box to your right that the number of organizations who are reporting a surplus or who are unsure of their fiscal year status, that those numbers have trended in ways that is concerning. When we ask organizations about the most pressing financial concerns related to the current climate, we see that the top concerns were decreases in or uncertainty about funding levels and the changing priorities of private or government funders. We also see that increased demand for their services was at the top of that list as well. This quote illustrates much of what we were hearing on this topic. Maintaining clarity of mission and financial sustainability over the next few years in the current political climate will be an existential challenge. And now, finally, key finding 3. Perhaps in light of these pressures, nearly all nonprofit leaders express concern about their own burnout and report that burnout is affecting their staff. Burnout was quite widespread. 87% of leaders expressed concern about their own burnout. And we see in the orange box here that 90% of the leaders that we surveyed reported that burnout is impacting their staff as well. This quote illustrates much of what we were hearing around this topic of burnout. Our biggest challenge is the morale of our staff and partners, as they are trying to keep work moving forward when many feel like their identity is being threatened. So in conclusion, the State of Nonprofits study, the data that we gather shows that nonprofit leaders are navigating multiple obstacles, whether it's political forces or funding concerns or staffing challenges. And we also see that leaders report a balanced budget or a surplus last year, but they're anticipating rising costs without increases in revenue. And then they're also expressing concern about burnout, both among their staff and their leadership. So we see from this data that funders and donors have a critical opportunity to support nonprofit organizations as they address some of society's most pressing issues. Now I'll turn our attention to a second report and a different set of data on Voices That Matter, how nonprofits and foundations engage with the communities they support. This report is really all about listening and how nonprofits and foundations are listening to communities. This data was gathered in August and the last fall of 2024 and in interviews of 2025. We mentioned the project funders and want to thank them again for their support of this work. And to start, our first finding from this data is that almost all nonprofits and foundations report using information provided by the communities they serve to guide their work. We see here that 89% of foundation leaders say they find information provided directly by those the foundation seeks to benefit most useful for shaping their work. And we see similar data from nonprofit leaders about collecting feedback from the communities that their organizations serve. We also see that nonprofits are using this data to make changes to their programs. They're either adjusting programs or revising programs, changing how staff interact with communities based on feedback that they're gathering. This quote illustrates much of what we were hearing from nonprofit leaders. We see here, and from foundation leaders as well, about listening. Key finding 2 in this study is that the most common challenge to feedback collection cited by nonprofits is limited capacity. However, most nonprofits report receiving no foundation support for these efforts. We see here that lack of capacity is a top challenge to nonprofits for collecting feedback. And when we look at the data from 2013 and 2024, we see that there has been some change between those years as well. We also see that few funders provide assistance for feedback collection, as highlighted in the data, highlighted here in the orange box to your left. And then this quote illustrates much of what we were hearing from foundation leaders. We don't fund feedback collection specifically, but we started to ask ourselves what we provide to our nonprofit partners beyond the grant dollar. For example, we have convenings and we connect them to other resources based on needs they might have. And finally, key finding 3. While most foundation leaders believe their work already reflects a deep understanding of community needs, nonprofits report that their funders would be better able to support their organization if they developed a deeper understanding of the communities they seek to benefit. Here we see that nonprofits report that many funders lacked a deep understanding of community needs. When we dig deeper and see the benefits of understanding community needs and how that's indicated, then we see that better appreciation for challenges faced by nonprofits or changes in the way that funding is delivered to nonprofits are ways that can be illustrated. This quote illustrates much of what we were hearing. And finally, each of these quotes highlights some of the advice that we heard from foundation leaders on how to better understand community needs. So in conclusion, nonprofit and foundation leaders are both using information from the people and communities they serve to shape and guide their work, but lack of capacity is the greatest challenge. And then most nonprofits believe that few of their funders have funding priorities that reflect a deep understanding of the needs of those they serve. Nonprofits also say that better funder understanding will lead to increased and more efficient support of their grantees. So I look forward to our discussion around this topic.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And I would like to welcome all our panelists into the conversation now. Alicia, that was a lot of data, but super useful to ground us. Appreciate again all your work. So Shelley Pritchard, welcome. Shelley is president and CEO of the Wichita Foundation. Melinda Twan is a managing director of Fund for Shared Insight. Candace Jones is the president and CEO of Public Welfare Foundation. And everybody met Greg and Alicia already. Candace, let's start with you because you fund in the criminal justice area, and so I imagine Greg's story is a pretty familiar one for you. how do you think about that, and how has Public Welfare Foundation responded to this moment of crisis, I assume, for many of your grantees?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate you raising that up and Greg, you sharing what happened. Look, I'll start by just being frank with you. We have, I know exactly the day that Greg is talking about. When he was reading the letter, I was like, it's almost like we got one because I can almost quote it verbatim because we heard so many copies from partners and grantees and we had to step up. But the truth, and I'll lead with this, is that we did have to take some responsive action of partners of ours who also were cut. But the truth is, for philanthropy, no matter what we're doing, it's just not enough. We cannot match the scale of what was lost by organizations. And I think that we constantly have to hold that as our responsibility in this moment and moving forward. We had to do a suite of emergency grants to respond to partners of ours that lost funding. Things that we saw in tandem, and I'm sure Greg can speak to this, is that the criminal justice space really has seen a broad shrink in funding, I think, as a resurgence of tough on crime narrative and sort of people really recognizing that it was such a difficult and sometimes intractable issue. There were people who retreated from the difficulty of it. And so we had that coupled with the loss of the federal funding, which really put the field writ large and our particular grantees on their heels. So we've done emergency funding to respond to grantees in our portfolio. We also tried to sweep up some of the resources that we have for other organizations that we hadn't traditionally funded within our strategy, but really were at threat of either closing their doors, having to lose core functions of their operations to be able to operate. And so we've been focused on that over the last couple months. But even with that, it's just not enough for the scale of need that we're seeing across the field.
Candace, what I hear you saying, and correct me if this isn't fair, is philanthropy can't fill the gap, but you can't do nothing either. And it sounds like you have taken some action. So how do you think about what to do within those parameters, right? You can't do it. You can't fill the gap. It's impossible. You don't have the funds, but you can't default to just business as usual. So how do you think about that? Have you had to reevaluate your spending levels?
I would frame it in a different way. I
Okay.
think part of what you're saying, which is I think not exactly what I'm saying, is that you're taking this position, which is true, is that philanthropy won't be able to assume the full responsibility for a loss of federal funding. Okay, we'll bank that. That was what you were saying. Actually, I think I would frame what I was saying differently, which is that we can't over congratulate ourselves for anything that we've done because
Mm,
it's not enough. And I think that while what you say can still be true, the way I frame what I was saying is a little bit different because one of them retains some responsibility while the other one distances itself from that responsibility. So I just want to qualify that and then
appreciate
to
that.
answer your question, which is, yeah, we had to do something. I mean, that was sort of a no-brainer. We had to think about the resources that we had left in the balance of this year. We've been a lot of conversation with our board about what is going to be our spending in a new year, right? This conversation about what we spend, what we should be spending to sort of meet this moment in history. And so all of those things needed to happen. But I just wanted to qualify because I actually think that that's a really important distinction between, I think, a relevant point you're making, but I think there's some like responsibility that actually I don't want to distance myself from the responsibility.
Totally hear you. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Shelley, you're in Wichita. You're running a community foundation that is serving almost by definition a diverse donor community and a diverse grantee population. Obviously, you're in a state where I imagine your donors have a wide range of views on issues, on politics. And also, you've got grantees who are reeling from some of the same dynamics that Greg described. At the highest level, how are you thinking about this? How are you navigating this moment?
We're just making sure that we spend time to listen. We've used the data that Alicia went over, and we also worked with one of the larger funders in our community, which is a health foundation and our United Way. And we did our own survey, so that we have that local data to talk about. So we can take the national information and the things that Greg and Candace are experiencing, and we have to bring it local for our fund holders. Of the funds we grant out every year, about 75% of that is donor directed. So no matter what the community foundation board and staff fund, we still, are the core of a community foundation. It's rapidly changing, but the core of our work is to steward our donors' funds. And so we're having active conversations with them. We've used our local reporting, which very closely mirrors the CEP results, in that they need flexible and unrestricted funding, and they need multi-year grants. So we're talking about that, and we're talking increasingly with individual fund holders about the absolute need for don't just fund the project, because you have to have the people and the overhead and everything else to fund the project. I had an interesting conversation just a few days ago where talking about federal cuts to a very critical program, and the fund holder said, well, the nonprofits will step up. And I said, the nonprofit doesn't get funding anymore from them. And he had never thought about that tension that is between that. So there was a huge aha moment for him. And so we're trying to act across the community and talk about this, but then also individual donors. We shared CEP's research and our research with our board and are asking them to talk to their networks. So really trying to be a convener and spread the messages throughout the community of how this is impacting the people that are helping those that are less fortunate than them.
Yeah, a lot of listening and educating. It sounds like, what is the response that do you feel like donors understand or are understanding, maybe this is impossible to generalize, the degree of challenge that's documented in the survey results that you shared with us, and which I agree are strikingly similar to what we saw in our national survey? Do you think donors are hearing it,
we're early
getting
in
it?
this process. So we've just had this data a few weeks, so we're early in the process. But I think even before the political climate and everything has changed so differently, I think even before that, people were starting to see the value of being invested longer term. So for example, we've done a lot of funding in news and information, and people don't understand, well, what's the sustainability of that? Because the old news and information model isn't working. And just like they give every year to the children's home and the symphony and their church, that's the sustainability model. So we already had started that conversation, and this is like the next iteration of it, which is great because it's giving us a chance to get in front of these fund holders, and we have new information to talk about with the data, and we have the anecdotal stories because we're as deep in our community as we can be.
Yeah, I just think community foundations are just so vital right now. Like they're just so important as in the bridging function that you play, the mobilizing and education function, and I applaud your effort to listen and elevate what you're hearing, and that's a good segue to Melinda. Melinda, you've been all about funder listening. That's your jam, and that's been a big focus of the Fund for Shared Insight. I'm so curious, like, how you think about it in the context of this particular set of challenges that the country is experiencing.
Thanks, Mel. We've been so pleased to support CEP's research, especially this most recent one that was released yesterday about voices that matter. And what we see is quite similar to what we saw during COVID, with some changes in that everyone was asking, what can we do? What can funders do? During COVID and as well as right now in these challenges, I think the challenge to funders is to really listen to communities and to ask those questions about how the community is doing, how the nonprofits are doing, what can funders do, as Candace mentioned, about providing more funding, doing it earlier, releasing restrictions. We saw a lot of that happening during COVID and some of that happening now. Something that I think is challenging, though, that I see in this current movement is that we see more funders that are still saying, like, let's wait and see. And I just don't understand that. Why funders are literally saying, well, let's see what happens. Because we are in a massive crisis in terms of the sector, and we should be listening more deeply. I love what Shelley shared about how Wichita partnered with a health conversion foundation and the United Way to listen together, because we also don't want to be bombarding the communities and nonprofits all asking the same questions, but coordinating, and that should be on us, the funders, to coordinate our listening efforts to make sure that we're not being extractive, that we're being very attentive to the needs of the communities that we're seeking to serve. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to listen and act swiftly and wisely, getting the money out there, releasing restrictions on funds, releasing restrictions on reporting. I don't understand why funders are waiting, frankly. So any of
Do
you,
you have a hypothesis, Melinda?
I think funders are, I think we're in a moment where the administration has attacked the nonprofits. They're also threatening to attack foundations. And that was not the case before. It was just we were all, during COVID, attacked by this disease that really brought us together. Whereas, as we've seen in the sector and in the law firms and in the universities, there's individual institutions that are taking it into their own hands and waiting to see what others are doing. And I would like to see that philanthropy could step up in this moment to do a more coordinated response across all the foundations and not be afraid of being singled out by the administration, because we're doing the right thing to be responsive to communities being most harmed by this, which are the ones which have historically been systematically most harmed, those affected by systemic racism and other intersectional inequities. So I think there's a fear that foundations have about being singled out for doing what we think we should be doing. I would love to hear, Phil, what you think about what's causing people to step back. And also, Shelley, in your work, especially working with individuals, are they like also holding back? They're like, we'll just wait and see.
Well, let me say, first of all, that I think it's actually very hard to generalize, because I see funders stepping up. I see some of them stepping up in coalition in impressive ways. And I see other funders that are not stepping up in the ways that I, as an observer of philanthropy, might wish that they would. And then I think I've come to appreciate over recent months the time it sometimes takes to bring a board along to the decisions that the CEO and staff might think are needed. And I've had more than a few people tell me, as I've been sort of raising the alarm and writing things about, what I think the data that we have gathered suggests funders should do. You don't understand, Phil. I'm working on it, and I've got a board that isn't there yet, but I'm working on it. So I think there's a lot of different contexts, and I have been critical at times in the last 5 months or so, 6 months, of funders' response, but I also appreciate that it's hard to generalize. There's a real diversity. But Shelley, you were trying to get in on this.
Yeah, I think because so much of our funding is donor directed, they are also being very, very cautious. We're in the middle of Kansas. It's heavy aerospace manufacturing, it's agriculture, it's oil, it's industries that are also being affected by changes. And so if they normally put $250,000 in their donor advice fund every year, they may put half of that, because they don't know how it's personally going to impact them, their investments, if they're going to need to do something, especially like on the farming front. So I think individual donors are being cautious. We're again working with our board, as Phil is, as I know the other, like the Health Foundation funding, they're thinking about long term and trying to be strategic, because we don't know what's yet to come, and so they have to think how go very maybe narrowly in their focus area as opposed to responding broadly to every immediate emergency.
I appreciate you raising that, Shelley, because I think there's a financial side sometimes that's driving trepidations that either foundations don't talk about enough or people don't quite understand. But I agree a lot with what both you and Phil said. I've seen, the field, as we all know, is not a monolith, but I have seen people stepping up and some good coalitions to sort of be standing together. For me, what it raises, and I was thinking about this earlier, when Alicia was presenting the data, is that, and you hit it on the head, Melinda, in your comments, a lot of the stuff that we are hearing as needs were things that we heard in COVID. if we're frank, right, and some of us have been around sort of in different iterations, there are things that we heard before that. We need the flexibility to be able to meet moments. We need the ability to run organizations. And Shelley, I actually love it because I think it's fungible to the community foundation model, where when so many of your resources are locked up in donor funds, when something unforeseen happens, you're really scrambling to be able to make the case for, allow for pivots, meet the moment. That is true for nonprofit leaders when so much of their resources are locked up in project and program grants that are not as flexible. There are things about operating organizations, all of which that cannot be foreseen. And so this also invites an opportunity for philanthropy writ large to be taking some of this feedback, not as a response to a moment, but really as a way that we do business going forward. Because I don't think we just heard about it for the first time in COVID. And I think that it keeps coming up because really what people are voicing is sort of like longer term structural changes that needs to happen in between philanthropy and the organizations that we run, to give them the latitude to really run healthy, thriving, successful organizations that are always going to be a part of a broader world.
Well, let's bring Greg back into this then, from the context of leading a nonprofit, knowing that also we're all looking out at the potential impact, the impact, I should say, of folks losing medical coverage, of folks losing access to food assistance. In this context, Greg, what are you looking for from funders?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the responses. I mean, I think, and Candace, as you said, COVID gave us an opportunity to do some things that we hoped well before that it was going to happen, right? And we were able to do it, and it's working out, really well, right? And so I think the practices of, you know, flexible funding, multi-year commitment right now is huge, just given the uncertainty, right? So I think those type of practices, and even just the administrative requirements, right? Again, we are very much data driven, but I also know many nonprofits, when you're going to be down at this point where you have to give up something, administrative staff is going to likely be the areas where you'll have to cut back, right? Because you want to keep your team on the street and so forth. And so that means, funders knowing that, and just helping being aware of that and being able to kind of support that. But I would also agree, now's the time. Nonprofits have to dig in, and we would definitely say now is the time. It's not only be able to help support it, but it's the impact you could have, right? Because as funders coming in at this moment in time, to, as you said, to meet that moment, you can keep organizations sustainable, right? You can keep on moving forward. Where we've seen organizations shut their doors down.
Yeah.
And as an organization that started out grassroots, I know how that would have affected us. And so I think that's huge. The other thing I would say is that we're an organization that we believe firmly in the importance of doing the direct service work with young adults and doing the systemic change work on the policy. We do that locally, statewide, and nationally. We have a training center. We work with, a variety of institutions. I think funding that type of work is another way to be able to move this forward, right? We need to be able to have that policy work supported, whether it's locally, statewide, or nationally. So I'd say that, and I think, Phil, to your, in terms of the bill that just passed, we all know it's going to have cuts around SNAP and Medicaid. The other piece, though, even if, organizations would say, well, I may not be working in that area or so forth, the reality is, from my perspective, every state's going to then have to have a trickle down approach because they're going to have to make up a gap, right? Somehow, if the states choose to make up that gap. So the states that choose to make up that gap in funding are going to have to pass along cuts across the board. So we are bracing for that potential, whether it's in Massachusetts and I think in many other states, that'll be real. So that's what we're thinking about as well. So this is the direct cuts we got from the DOJ, or the direct cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, I think will also be added onto, unfortunately.
Right. This is it does feel like an unbelievably challenging context that is different from the pandemic in some of the ways that have been described. And Alicia, I want to welcome you back into the conversation too. I mean, I guess this burnout issue, right, is real. we're saying, I hear, in your data and in Melinda's comments, this notion that like, listening is even more important. Yet another thing nonprofit leaders need to do, because the community needs are going to be changing as the context changes. And then folks are feeling under such pressure and stress from a sense of rolling crises. Um, how do we even think as funders beyond multi-year flexible support? How should funders think about um, being helpful to nonprofits in dealing with the burnout issue? Or how can nonprofit leaders themselves, what advice do we have, for guarding against that burnout? Because we need the folks doing this work. I guess I'm just struggling with like, what can we practically do to give folks a sense of hope that they can take care of themselves in the way that we need them to? Anybody want to jump in on that, Alicia?
Yeah, well, one thing I'll just share from the data that we've been gathering over the last few years is, we were already seeing burnout before this particular moment. And so, you know, going coming out of COVID, and now nonprofits reeling at this moment from the just uncertainty, of course, is contributing to burnout. But we know from some of the other data that we have, for instance, from our big gift study, that, receiving unrestricted support for organizations over multiple years can be helpful, because it does things like, for instance, in that the work that we've done around that, we see that when organizations receive large unrestricted gifts, about 54% of them use some of that funding to do collaborations with other organizations that they had not been able to do in the past. And we know that being able to do this work for the long haul means having to do it in deep partnership. But that also means that there are two humans who require salaries and time to do that work. And we often don't think about resourcing it in that way. And so, in addition to unrestricted support, multi-year support, it's important also for funders to be supporting organizations work together and realizing that that requires resources to do that. And it's especially important in a moment where we see, for instance, there are cuts to Medicaid, and then the cuts that Greg talked about, right? Like, so maybe partnerships that are forming that folks haven't even thought about before, but that once again requires resources. And so just being creative and flexible about the funding and resources for organizations to work together, and supporting leaders in a moment that has so much uncertainty. So whether that's sabbaticals or ways for leaders to work together is really crucial, so that folks are able to continue doing this work for the long haul.
Yeah, and this is maybe a good bridge to, I appreciate there's a lot of questions coming in, and so folks keep them coming. And one that gets to the point that you're making, Alicia, about finally this is all about resources. One person on the webinar says there are all these conversations about nonprofits closing, merging, or shifting their model in this climate. What conversations are happening in the foundation world about sunsetting, spending down, giving more than planned, or sharing resources with local communities? I'd love to hear a response from Shelley, Candace, and Melinda to that question.
I think this gets to the point that Alicia's talking about. I think there are conversations talking about spending more. I haven't heard a lot of conversations about spending down, though I do think some of those conversations are happening. I mean, I've talked about this in other contexts, like we've been having some real existential conversations, but I think that's more unique. I think people are very much talking about they can give more, they can step up, but in a way that preserves their corpus over time. And this is why I think Alicia's point is so important. So much of this comes down to a scratch, right? Like, you're less burnt out if you have all the people you need. Greg's like, we will let the administrative staff go. But if you don't let the work go, that just means that somebody else who already has a full-time job is going to then be doing that job. And a lot of times in nonprofits, that's what happens. Like, the thing has to get done. They're just going to plug somebody else in to do it, and that exacerbates burnout. I don't think somebody as a foundation president wants a pep talk from me to make them feel better. They want more money to be able to make the choices that they need to make to be able to sustain themselves. If you have a reserve as an executive director and you don't constantly have to be concerned about fundraising calls and this next event to get money, dollars in the door, you have a little bit more capacity to collaborate, to think strategically about what's coming and where the institution is headed. And it's like, it's true, all that comes back to scratch. And there's not equity in a field like philanthropy where there are a lot of resources between nonprofits where there's not. I think, I don't know that many, foundation leader surveys where everybody's like, we're burnt out, because and it's not like we are, superhuman or smart. It's just that you have the resources to be able to do things that you need to do to make sustaining the work much easier. And so that's why I think it's like we cannot underscore sort of like healthy, fulsome. I tell my team all the time, because during COVID, one of the things we did was wellness grant. We did this round of wellness grants, and there were like some groups in the field that were doing that at this time. And I was kind of like, we got to kind of check that, because if we're funding in a way in the first instance that allows the organization the flexibility, you could do like a special campaign, which I think can be important, but you also need to be in the first instance being like, how are we structuring this organization over multi-year with enough fulsome funding to really have the flexibility to do what they need to do? And we're constantly in that tension. Like, do you offer more TA, or are you funding the organization in a way where they have the capacity to be able to do that for themselves, which both gives them more agency to make the choices about what they need to be doing? So it's tricky. Like, there's no like that. Whoever raised that question, it's like there is not a comparable. That's a real irony there, because it's not happening on the same side. Like, because the resources are there at scale to make sure that nobody is even worried about that at this point.
Thanks, Candace.
I think I would take a different angle on,
No,
Shelley.
go ahead. You go.
So some of the questions I saw in the Q&A were also around capacity building, around listening. And I think building on what Candace was saying, like in addition to obviously doing the multi-year support and thinking longer term, I think there's an opportunity for us as funders to help the nonprofits to build their capacity to do the work that they're doing. And there's a question I think about, do you do unrestricted, or do you do it like restricted around capacity building? And I'd say you ask your nonprofit partner, how would you like the funds? Oftentimes the nonprofits will say, could you please restrict the funding around capacity building, around listening to our communities and the participants of our programs? Because if it's just general operating support, it makes it harder to make sure that we're actually investing in that important area of our work. And we originated and spun off a program called Listen for Good, which does a lot of work with funders and nonprofits around building the capacity of their institutions to really listen to the community in an ongoing, systematic way. And that often involves grants that funders will make to go along with the Listen for Good capacity building, so that there's the people available to do that work and to have the capacity built in them. So I'll just mention Listen for Good as an important resource. But I also want to think about this sunsetting thing. And we're not a foundation because we're a funder collaborative, but we are sunsetting. And I will say that knowing that we're going to sunset and how much money we have left gave us the freedom to be able to say to our board, in this moment, we need to call every single one of our grantee partners and ask them, do you need money now as opposed to a year from now? Because we have the money, we've raised it all. And would you like it, part of it now? Would you like it tomorrow? Would you like it? Just let us know. So I called Phil, I called a bunch of different nonprofit partners that we had, and saw the writing on the wall, especially with what was happening with the schools and Youth Truth and the important work that Youth Truth does. And just said, like, would a couple $100,000 now be helpful as opposed to waiting? And in many cases, the answer was yes, now would be good. In some cases, said no, we're actually good, but it's good to know that we could call you at any moment to release those funds so that we have them available. So I think maybe in a sunsetting way that makes us more flexible, but I could argue that funders in general could be more flexible around that too.
Yeah, and first of all, Melinda, thanks for all your support of the infrastructure for listening. So CEP runs a program called Youth Truth that Melinda mentioned, that surveys young people in schools raises up their perspectives. It's led by David McKinney, but the founding CEO was Valerie Threlfall, who now runs Listen for Good. She and I connected recently, and like, it's not easy to get support for these efforts, and yet these efforts are what allow people to know what is actually most needed and what is actually most valuable, which lets you then target your resources and your strategies in the ways that are going to make the greatest difference on the people whose lives you're trying to improve, who, after all, are the best experts on what's useful, right? The people you're trying to help. So that's that's the case for listening. But Shelley, going back to this issue of, why not spend more now? And how do you think about that as a CEO of a community foundation?
Well, the traditional community foundation model is we're here forever, perpetuity, and we're seeing that change a lot. We think people, like, we don't talk about it anymore, that community foundations used to say that was the first thing is, well, how big are your assets? And now we don't use that, but we talk about how much money we get out the door every year, and that has increased exponentially. There's still some community foundations who hold onto those assets and don't think about part B of that question. Our board has actively talked about it. We actually increased our payout on the funds that we manage for our own capacity, because we had trouble raising that money for capacity. So the money that our board and staff directed, we increased that from 4 to 6.5% or 7.5% for 3 years, so we could grow to do the listening that we're learning about how to do from Melinda. So even internally in community foundations, that can often be the case. We recently converted a private foundation to a designated fund here, and she wanted it to be paid out in 10 years. And so we're seeing more interest in that, where people used to think about what's my legacy, and they would have these grandiose plans, and that can be important. But if the agency doesn't exist right now, or these kinds of national crises impact the organization, it goes away or vastly lowers the service it can provide, what's the point of having the money there in 50 years? So those conversations are increasing. It's been slow, and even internally it's slow here, but at least we're having the conversations, I think.
Thanks, Shelley.
I just want to jump in for
Yeah, please, Greg.
just 1 second. Hey, I want to shout out Melinda. I appreciate all the work that Listen for Good has been doing. It's been super helpful, and we've been a part of it in the past. And I think that, in the same way as listening, I would also raise up the importance of speaking up, right, from a funder perspective, and helping mobilize, right? Because I know certain foundations, may not get engaged in policy or in supporting policy, but there are many others that do. And again, we stress that. But just the idea of being able to have other voices, if something is on really shaky ground, being able to have the funder perspective, the funder voice, and speaking up and mobilizing others. I think now is a moment for that to have huge impact. Whether it's mobilizing to get new donors, right? It's a very different thing if a funder can mobilize and create a new fund in response to this than, UTEC. Because to be honest, I don't want to fundraise just for UTEC right now, right? Because it's a field issue, right? I want to support the entire field, right? There are organizations we work and partner with that are really struggling. So we want to help support those organizations. There's an opportunity to speak up and I think mobilize. And I just would raise that as well. So
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate that.
you
We're in our last 10 minutes here, or less. So I want to give you each, Shelley, Candace, Melinda, Greg, Alicia, a chance, let's say 30 seconds, because you'll then go over, to share the one thing you'd want to say to funders right now. It just by way of advice. Because look, if there's one thing I've realized over the last 5-6 months is folks are struggling, thoughtfully, with good intentions, for what are the best steps for them to take. And of course, the answers are going to be different based on the context. But given where you sit, what's a message you'd like to get across as we wrap up here, or a point that you'd like to make that you haven't yet been able to make? And I'll let anybody start.
I think I'll just start because I will kick us off and be an efficient use of time. But the future is watching, right? Like history is being made right now. Melinda touched on this a little bit in the beginning. So much of what we're thinking about is whether or not, you're waiting for the big moment, like the moment to be having those existential conversations and then actually the action that flows out of it. I think we're in a really important and critical moment. And if people are saving it up for another day, I think that that's sort of ill-informed. The time is now to sort of really be like, this is the moment we're all sort of waiting to meet. And so, I do think that there is still going to be a diversity of perspective, but if you're saving it, I think that instinct is wrong. People really need to be engaged right now. They need to be meeting the moment. And I think that is true in philanthropy, but I think that's just true across the board.
Thank you. Really appreciate that.
And I'll add to that. So in this moment, uh, I co-wrote a piece for the CEP blog with Britt Lake from Feedback Labs, which is another key infrastructure organization, encouraging people to listen and hear from the communities. But it was called Turn on Your Headlights, How Funders Can Cut Through the
I
Chaos
love that
Right
piece.
Now. And the analogy we draw is like, if there was an emergency and you're like, I need to get someone to the hospital and put them in the car, but you don't turn on your headlights, you're going to get into a bigger accident and more than one person is going to be injured. Listening is the way that we can turn on our headlights to make sure that we are focusing on the things that are most important, that the community itself that knows best what they need, the nonprofits that know best what they need. Listening is a way that we can turn on those headlights and make sure that we see clearly how we can best get to the right kind of help that the sector needs.
Thank you, Melinda.
I would say that we have to give people the space and grace to do what they're doing and consider their mental health. And, even if one more person says, take a break, I'm going to, just slap them, because you can't save the kids that Greg is saving if there's nobody on the street doing that. So we have to think about that. So if we do a grant round, you have to lower the barrier to entry. Don't make them fill out a 20-page report if you're not ever going to read it, or you don't use that information, or even if you do, figure out a way to do it without 20 pages. So, if they don't respond to your email in 24 hours, that's okay. It's not if it's an emergency, you probably have their cell phone, call them. So just give the leaders who we're trying to help them that space and grace to do the work that they're trying to do.
I love that, Shelley. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say now's a huge ROI opportunity from a funder perspective to have impact. And I think the other impact is when you speak up and you mobilize on behalf of organizations that are being attacked, that has huge value, right? From a nonprofit, we've had funders step up and the impact is huge and so appreciative. But when people are speaking alongside you and when we know the work that we're doing is potentially an attack, that is huge and hugely appreciated as well. And on that, I just
Yes.
want to thank you, Phil, again, for helping raise this up for everybody, because it's hugely important right now.
Thanks for sharing your story, Greg. Really, really appreciate it. Alicia?
Yeah, I would just say that, sometimes it can feel immobilizing, like where to start. But there are so many tools that we know that work. So, for instance, during COVID, we know people reduced their reporting requirements. They streamlined their applications. We have data that shows that happened, and life went on, and people still did really important work and achieved amazing things. We did a report last year on endowment grant making. It's a tool that's only used by about 30% of foundations, but also something that we know can be really powerful towards financial security. If folks are like, oh, but how do we start to listen? We have looked at data that shows if you're not sure how to listen, but you use an intermediary that's really aligned with the values of community, they can help with that. And so I would just say there are a lot of solutions out there. It's just figuring out which of the tools in your toolbox you might want to try on, especially at this moment, because there are lots of things that can be done.
I love that. It's like Lincoln said, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. But I want to close with a contemporary of Lincoln's, a great quote that maybe everybody knows from Frederick Douglass. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And I close with that because it's not supposed to be easy, folks. So this is tough, but we can rise to the challenge. And I so appreciate hearing the way that Shelley, Candace, Melinda, and Greg are doing just that. Greg, I'd say we're all thinking of you and your work, your street level work. And Alicia, I just want to again underscore my appreciation to you and our great research team, as well as our colleagues on our programming and external relations team who are helping to get the word out about the data that we've developed. Really grateful to everybody who tuned in. Send us a note if you liked it, if you didn't like it. We want feedback. I think a survey will probably go out too. And I'm going to hand it over to Sarah. And thank you, Sarah. And again, thanks to all the panelists. I'll let Sarah close us out.
Thank you, Phil. And thank you so much to our fantastic panelists. So with that, I'd like to bring our discussion today to a close. Thank you for your amazing questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get into every single one. As Phil mentioned, you'll receive a survey in your inbox if you haven't already, asking for feedback on this event. And we generally would appreciate you taking a minute or two to fill it out. It really does help us. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next time. All right, take care, everyone.